everybody. Awesome. Yep, we're going to talk about Nuxt server components. Thanks for the introduction. Does anybody remember Ember.js here in the audience by a show of hands? It had its time, but today we're going to be talking about Vue and Nuxt. It's one of my favorite frameworks, so let's, without further ado, let's jump in. Who here uses React as well, or has used React in the past? Okay, that's almost everyone. So the reason I came up with this talk was because I saw this React ecosystem and with Next, and how everybody was talking about server components, kind of this paradigm shift in the way that React works and these server components. And I wanted to know, what is Vue doing to help with this? Like, what's Vue's answer to React server components? And doing some research and talking to Daniel Rowe and some of the Nuxt core contributors, they said they actually had this. This was available on the Nuxt side. And if you don't know, of course, Nuxt is a meta framework for Vue, similar to Next. But they have a very different approach between the two. So I'm going to talk to you guys today about how Nuxt is dealing with server components and how you might want to use it in your next application. This is so cool. I'm in a theater. I've never done a presentation in a theater. This is awesome. So first, to start with, is that these are not the same. If you've been in the React ecosystem and you're using Next.js, I'm going to be saying that a lot, Next and Nuxt, it's not the same implementation for Nuxt. And there's quite a few differences between the two. I think the spirit of both are the same, though. The idea of trying to take components and have them work on the server and on the client side, that is the same, but the implementation and the details between both are different. So I have a warning through this talk. What I'm talking to you about today is experimental. So meaning that use at your own risk. Things could change in the API. It could break in the future. Although I have used it in my personal projects, and I have not seen a whole lot of issues, but I have seen a few bugs here and there, and the Nuxt core team have been great about answering questions, fixing them, and moving forward. They actually have a full RFC that you can look at and comment. They have a roadmap that we're going to be talking about. So as of today, and it has been for several months, over a year now, a little less than a year, it has been an experimental feature. But let me ask you this. Does any of you use experimental features? I see one. So maybe this will make you want to try it out. And here is, I also like to live dangerously. So I do use experimental features occasionally, but I do my due diligence, especially if I want to use it in something like a production environment. So let's talk about what is it. Nuxt Server Components allows server rendering individual components within your client-side app. So you can take you can basically make a component in your Nuxt.js app, a single file component, and convert it over to a server component. Let's take a look. So there's a lot of different terms you hear about when you're dealing with these meta frameworks: server-side rendering, static-side generation. Let's go through a few definitions to kind of get an idea of how this network will work. And this is approximation. It's approximately how it works, and it's kind of like a high-level overview. I'm using my favorite drawing tool, Excalidraw here, but let's talk about server-side rendering first. So in Nuxt, you can have each individual route or each individual component be either server-side rendered, static site generated. And with server-side rendering, the idea is that the data is fetched, the server generates the page, it sends back HTML, CSS, and JS. The browser displays the page, and then Nuxt in the background does this hydration piece. Essentially, on the first load, it loads quicker because it's running it on the server-side rendered. But then in the background, it hydrates the pages and all the routes, and then at that point, it's basically the same thing as like a single-page application. And this, by the way, differs slightly when you're talking between different frameworks. But this is essentially Nuxt. And they also call this, there's different terms that Nuxt uses, calling it hybrid mode and things like that. A universal mode, you may see that in the documentation. What about static site generation? How does that work? Well, in a static site generated app, what happens is when you build your app, it starts generating all those pages. It actually pre-renders them is another term you hear, where it actually goes in, it does all the API calls, it grabs all the data, and does that at build time. Then, once your web browser connects to this, all the HTML, CSS, and JS are sent down. It's pretty quick. And then the browser displays the page. For years, people were saying, this is how we want to do the web. This is how we want to do Nuxt and other frameworks. But what people found out is this, and you probably can't see my my clicker here, but the pages generated part, that part could take a very long time depending on how big your site is. So that could be an issue. So what about server rendering? So we've kind of defined this static site generation, server-side rendered. But what happens if we start using these server components in our app? Well, we do have this kind of loading part, but the loading part is happening on the server, which is much quicker. So the data is fetched, the server generates the page, it serves the HTML, CSS, and JS, and then your browser displays the page as active. There's really no hydration that happens as what you do with like a server-side rendered app. And typically, like server, if you just were in the last talk with Kent C. Dodds, he talked about this idea of having, like in the past, we just had websites and you had the server, and the server would kind of handle everything, and every single page would be like a different server reload. And you kind of think of the server rendering sort of like that. People, let's move on. So I've been talking for a few minutes here, for 5 minutes, and I haven't introduced myself, so I'll do that real quick. I'm a senior developer advocate for AWS, and I'm on the Amplify team. Probably thinking, why is someone from AWS at a front-end conference? But we actually have a whole set of tools. Here would be my 1-minute plug for AWS. This will be the last time I talk about it. But we have a whole set of tools to help front-end developers create full-stack apps. If you do hosting, we actually worked directly with the Nuxt team about 6 months ago to make sure that if you have a Nuxt app and you want it server-side rendered or static site generated, you can just use our hosting service and we automatically detect it and we do everything for you. And that's through our Amplify hosting is what we call it. So I just want to kind of give a shout out for that. And we have a whole bunch of tools to help create full stack apps without having to be an AWS expert. So here are some of the goals for this talk. And I will leave some time at the end for questions and for you to get to, I guess we'll have a break right after this, but for you to catch up on that break after. So we're going to talk about why use server components in the first place, what it's not, how to set them up, code examples. We might even go into a little bit of a demo, and I'll show you some other experimental features that are coming. And we'll talk about slots, fallbacks, and future improvements. So we got a lot. So why should you use server components? So everybody here in the audience probably wants to know, why should I use this in my app, my Vue.js app? Well, of course, and you can say the same thing for your React if you're in other frameworks. But one thing is that by using server components, it takes everything in that server component and it extracts it out of the normal bundle that will be delivered to the client. So you can reduce the bundle size that the client has. And that's important because with a lower bundle size, there'll be a faster time to render for the browser, faster time to paint. And that's important. You can now, obviously, since you're in the server, all that server code can now kind of be inside your components. And you can have secrets in there, and they're more secure now because they're on the server side. And this is an odd slide. You're thinking, don't need a server. Well, you can actually write server components in your applications. And if, let's say, you wanted to statically generate your whole site, you can do that even though you specify a component as a server component, which I'll show you how we do in a moment. Nuxt is smart enough that it will pre-render every page, including any server component page, and prefetch any data that it needs. So you don't even really need a server if you happen to want to statically generate your whole site. Of course, you would lose some benefits of using a server component, and it can be used like any normal component. You can have a brand new Nuxt application. You can put all your components in there, and then you can mark some of them as server components and use them. But there are drawbacks with anything else. There are limitations, and there's catches. We've talked about one big one at the beginning, that this is experimental. Of course, since we're in the server, we don't have the window. We can't do a regular manipulation with a window. We don't have any lifecycle hooks that you normally use, the on-mounted or whatever else. You have no interactivity. I'll put that with a star, because we'll talk about that in a moment. So your basic view example that you see in the documents where you're doing like a counter, if you're on a server component and you use a ref, that's not going to work. It's not going to like increment your counter right, but there are ways of getting past that. And then some things like Nuxt Link and some other of Nuxt ecosystem doesn't work exactly yet. So let's talk about the server component setup. Easiest way to set it up. You take your regular Vue component, single file component that we all know and love. You just add a .server.vue extension to it. Then you have a server component. However, you also, since it is an experimental feature, you have to go into your Nuxt config and add the component islands experimental feature and turn it to true. And then you can start using it in your app. So here is our Nuxt config. We have experimental components islands true. And this is all you need to do to start turning it on and start using it in your apps today. Kind of looks like this. User profile.server.vue would be the name of this component in your components folder. And just realize, just with all the nice things with Nuxt, with your auto imports, that still works with server components. You don't have to manually import your component. It'll detect it like normal. You can even do advanced use cases. I put this as optional because you lose some of the benefits of server components, but you can actually specify a client and a server component. So then it will run the server component first, and then it'll kind of hydrate, kind of like you're doing that static SSR server rendered app. So it'll then hydrate the client. So you can kind of get the best of both worlds. I've only seen this a few times, people using this in advanced use cases. Okay, so this is how it would work. So this could be a component that we have. We just use our user profile. We can pass things into it. We can use props and all those things that you normally do with components. This is a server component called user profile. And then this user profile would be rendered as if it's on the server. And then magic. The app bundle is smaller. We get all those nice features in it. But what about some other features like slots? I'm a huge slots fan. I use it everywhere inside my Vue apps. Obviously, it's just kind of fundamental to Vue. But how does that work with server components? Well, we can put something like this. Just like you'd use a normal slot between the opening and closing brackets of a user profile, we can put in some information. Now, the user profile is our server component. And then we can use scope slots. We can use name slots. Those all work with one caveat, one exception. So we'd still lose that interactivity. So once again, we can't use refs. We can't use counters. We can't make manipulation changes. As soon as it loads, it's going to be static. You're going to see what the server loaded, even if you're using slots, which is kind of a bummer. So you're probably thinking, like, well, that's a really big downside. How am I going to use this? So is there any other way? Recently, in the last 6 months, the Nuxt core team has introduced something called selective client. What does that look like? So now, what we can do is inside a server component, we can add a child component inside of it. So let's imagine this is our user profile component. We have this new counter. We have to add in this new prop called Nuxt-client. And what that'll do is the server component will still load. This is the child component counter will load inside of it, but it will retain all its interactivity. Therefore, you can do all your interactive stuff in there. So maybe you want a server component that has most of its static information, but you have some interactivity. You can make a child component, set it with Nuxt-client, and use this new feature. And that's this new feature called selective client. And this would be a part of your Nuxt config. You have to turn it on. I'll show you that when we get to the demo section. All right, so what about async server component? So maybe your server component is going out to the internet, it's grabbing a bunch of data, and how do we handle that? Well, we can do non-blocking server components. So in the past, when they first released this feature, you would have weird issues where if your server component was loading and it had to grab a bunch of data from a resource, it would block the whole page from loading, which obviously wasn't good. So they came up with this concept of non-blocking server components. And you have something called a lazy prop. And then you also have a fallback prop. Has anybody seen lazy or fallback before in any other context? Let's take a look how that works. So now we have our server component here. It's connecting to some example.com. It's probably huge. It's going to take 5 seconds to load all this data. It's almost kind of think of how we deal with suspense in Vue. But now we can say, hey, user profile component, which is a server component, lazy true, which means that don't load this server component until all the data has been downloaded. Once it's downloaded, then display it. While it's downloading, you'll use this fallback. And this fallback will show a message or a loading spinner or something like that. So that way you can still have the server component be there. It'll have a little loading spinner, and then once it's finished, the data will be loaded. And it doesn't block the whole page from loading. And that's this fallback right here. So that's the basics of server components. We got about 10 minutes, so I'm going to show you a few things that were happening in the future, and then we're going to jump into a demo. So what's on the roadmap for the future? So one thing I also didn't mention that they just recently, they added some improvements to talk to CMSs. They had some adapters and things like that. So if you're using a server component and you're talking to some external CMS, they added in some features there recently. But one other thing they haven't done yet is they want to do some more server-side performance optimizations. You'll find one thing I would not recommend if you want to try this out at home is doing multiple server components with inside server components with inside server components. There's some performance issues there, so they recommend not to do that. But if they are working on some better performance optimizations for it. They're also looking at better documentation in general for islands. All the documentation for server components is in their experimental docs on the Nuxt docs, and they're looking to just add some better documentation for it. They're also wanting to apply island features to non-single file components. So this is kind of an edge case. Some people don't use single file components. There are ways of doing that, and they are trying to add in some of those features to those non-single file components. At this point, you have to use Nuxt single file components to use server components. Before we jump into demo, let me show you a few other experimental features that should be interesting. One is inline route rules. So on each page level now, you can define a route rule. And what that means, kind of looks like this. So you have this define route rules. You can set it to pre-render or static generate or whatever you want. I guess pre-render is static generate, but you can do different types of rules here and how that individual page should render. That's one thing nice about Nuxt. You can have some pages render through static site generation, some pages route through SSR, some through server components, and you can do that all through this define route rules. There's other ways of doing it, of course, too, but this is just another experimental feature that they added. One is client fallback. Sometimes when you're running in SSR mode, there's issues. Now you can have a client fallback to it. And view transitions. Anybody use view transitions at all? Any other framework? It's kind of a neat new feature. It's just not specific to Nuxt that has a really nice way to do animations. So let me show you what that looks like. Here is a demo. It's on Stack Blitz. So here's a list of a bunch of TV shows. And if you click on any of these, you'll see how it kind of pops in. This is a part of the transitions API. So you can kind of do these fun transitions that, with any framework really, but this is now built into Nuxt to make it much easier to use. And now you can kind of do these fun transitions like this. Another thing that I could show you real quick is my VS Code. So here is an example, just very simple. I did this last night. But here, can we see this? Can you see it? Yeah, I think you can see a little bit of it. So yeah, experimental. This is how in your Nuxt config you would add in this new experimental feature. You just add this component islands. If you want to do the selective client, you can do true here, and that will turn on this option to have server components to have client components underneath them and have them be interactive. And so you can see in this example, this is a server component. Very simple example. Don't blame me for the naming. I have just Nuxt client here, and then in the sum comp, if you look at it, we have just a counter with a ref, and is my server running here? Yep. And then you can see here, my client component is actually the whole component's this hello server, and the client component still has interactivity. Here's an example of using slots, and slots, you still don't have that interactivity, but you can just display the information in there. So that's in this one right here. Here's in between the closing and opening brackets. This is a slot, and we have a button. We have a counter for it. And this won't render, and it won't be interactive, even though this is the initial route here. OK, let me jump back into the slides. And here is my presentation. Present. This right here are things that I have to give away. But I don't have them physically with me. Unfortunately, I could not bring them. However, you are lucky. You guys in the audience can get any of these from me. I just asked one specific thing. So these are just little things, swag bags that we have for AWS Amplify. We have like one with a mug and a pouch and some cleaning cloths, some stickers and things like that. We have a program to actually ship them to you. To do that, I have a way of doing that. Here is the QR code. If you scan this QR code, it'll take you to a survey. It'll have a link to my slides and a link to my LinkedIn. So if you want to take the survey, just give me some feedback. It's just 3 questions. It takes a few seconds. That'd be great. That way I can know if this is what people are interested in or if this is not. I can always update it and then connect with... Oh, you can't get it? Oh. Thank you for telling me. Let's try this again. I'm going to present. Does it work now? Let's see. I'm going to try. Well, I will look into if you're having problems with the QR code. Still see me afterwards, and I will. You know, it's probably because of the background, I bet. I will see if I can get you some of the swag that I have. You just need to connect with me with LinkedIn. We'll talk, and I can get that for you. Let me try one more thing here to see if I can. Okay, yeah, try that. Maybe because I have the black background. It's the only thing I can think of.
Maybe the text.
Yeah, maybe. Hold on. And I'll delete this. If you let me know if that works. If not, still see me afterwards, and when we can chat some more, and I can get you some of the free swag. So thank you.
Okay, so we have a couple minutes. If you guys have questions, we can. Is this on? We can go ahead and. I think it's off. Okay, now it's on. Yeah, we have a couple minutes for questions. Is there any question? I'll come to you so you don't have to yell across the theater. Any questions for Erik? Since there's no questions, I have so many questions, but yeah, I will ask you one question. Yeah, so what's the practical application for server-side rendering, like in companies that, what type of businesses are using it? Because here in Utah, like it's not very popular, like especially with you. So like what's the type of company, enterprise, business size that invests heavily on server-side render with you at Nuxt?
Yeah, it's all sorts of companies throughout use this tech, use server-side rendering. Since it is experimental on the Vue side, probably less, but I know I can speak for React and how Next has been really pushing that. So when you create a new Next app, server components are defaulted to use it. But I wouldn't say there's a particular type of company. All sorts of companies are using it. It just kind of simplifies, especially if you have full stack developers can easily go in and start doing some of the things that they had to rely on for backend devs, but now they can do it themselves.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.